let's see, just one day this week. Midterms are due today by close of business. That is 4 hours from now. So, enough said about that. I'm going to, some of these images may be disturbing, not because they're bloody, just because of what they represent. But, you know, you can't really talk about the African American experience where most people usually start. We're basically starting the second half with slavery. So we basically built up to that. So lots of people come to this in different ways, and since I was raised with a certain identity where the basic idea is no matter what they throw at you, you can come back from it, no matter what. And that's part of what the definition of what it means to be human. So, honoring the difficult is Alice Walker writing. And so, the irony of the land of the free being built on slavery is always a persistent part of the African American experience. And also becoming and being the country that also incarcerates more of its citizens than the most repressive regimes on earth cannot be ignored. Like when I grew up, basically, it was always contrasted that America is better than Russia, and that Russia was a police state. Well, now America incarcerates more of its citizens than Russia does. So, police state or not, in the land of the free, that's saying something. So, slavery has also come back to our shores, even after certain people got free. Certain others are not. So the way I tend to look at it, based on not only the history and some of the history that we'll be sharing in terms of responses to slavery, is that, as I may have said before, but because of my advanced age and CRS, can't remember stuff. I may have said this before, but Mexico freed the slaves before America, and Mexico had a black president before America. So I see people coming here. So Mexico also sheltered black slaves escaping the South before America because it was closer to Canada. So the way I see it is that people escaping Mexico to come here to freedom is basically analogous to a freedom struggle. No different. Economic slavery is still slavery, and slavery is an economic state in which you're first forced to work for free or below whatever you are used to working for, whatever that is. So school teachers, doctors are forced to become farm workers when they leave Mexico to basically, well, stay alive, essentially. But I digress, okay? The prison industrial complex, which also includes the juvenile justice system, one can say it never left. So part of honoring the difficult, one of the things that Alice Walker pointed out in her book, We Are the People We've Been Waiting For, she basically says the juvenile justice system came directly out of slavery. Directly out of slavery. So we haven't gotten to this time period yet, but we will in a few weeks, in the weeks that we have left to us. I basically point out that the Oregon Constitution, the quote-unquote anti-slavery parts of the Oregon Constitution, which essentially, okay, we're going to be a free state because we're going to ban black people from coming here. So, and we're going to whip them every 6 months if they don't leave. So that clause got changed from whipping every 6 months to we will arrest you and sell you to the lowest bidder. And that got enshrined in the Oregon Constitution, and then that became later the basis for the 13th Constitution of the United States, which ended slavery, but it didn't actually end slavery, because what it did was said no involuntary slavery except after conviction of a crime. Now, what's a crime? Well, it's the states that determine what a crime is, and a crime, it would be a crime for a black person to teach another black person to read, or attempt to vote, or attempt to work outside of agriculture. Like if you didn't want to be a farm worker, maybe you want to be a doctor or a dentist or an accountant. That could be illegal. You could be arrested for that and worked for free in the land of the free. So yeah, we eliminated slavery, but we created a criminal justice system where you could be criminal just for trying to exercise your human rights. Voting, reading, education. Yeah, okay, land of the free. So that's difficult. So while the first black American president currently occupies the White House, and the White House is built on slave labor, he is not a descendant of slaves and can only vicariously absorb the lessons of slavery. Unlike his wife, who slavery is part of her history. And you know, I cannot really overemphasize, when this is part of your consciously shared family history and you're raised with it, then it changes your psychology. You expect certain things. So nor can he, that is President Obama, speak on any length or to any depth on current manifestations of slavery and historic discrimination, though they affect him on a daily basis. Even though he was schooled by experts in constitutional law, he's a constitutional law lawyer, he cannot speak to the degree that a Derek Bell, who mentored him at Harvard, did. And that analysis of the Constitution that I talked to you about the other day came from Derek Bell's book. Okay, 9 interlocking articles in the Constitution protecting slavery because of the money. And basically, oh, the slaves rebel, then the federal government has a duty to put down the rebellion. We haven't gotten to the Civil War yet, so don't even get me started on Lincoln just yet, but I will. So the basic economic principles that maintain slavery still exist to support our society today. Okay, economic inequity, educational inequity, ignorance of certain laws, a number of things. So instead of individual families, we have multinational corporations maintaining a plantation-like atmosphere to supply us with products. So one example of that. Take my iPhone and my iPad and my Mac computer, but let's just stay with the iPhone and iPad. Foxconn in China. 300,000 people under one roof in one factory, making $20 for a 12-hour day. Under guard. Not only to make sure they don't steal anything, but also to make sure that they only take the prescribed breaks, etc., etc. $20 for a 12-hour day. All right? So 2,000 engineers to redo the specifications at the last minute if they need to change something like the glass on the plate or whatever. All right, so imagine that in one factory. So part of, slavery is an economic condition in which you're forced to work for, assuming that you have a worth or that you can expect to be compensated fairly for your labor, you are forced to work at below that compensation for somebody else's profit. and other people benefit from that. I certainly benefit. Normally, I like Apple stuff mostly because Apple at one point did not participate in totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany, like IBM did, et cetera, et cetera. You can say that they didn't do that. They used to give computers away free to schools and all that. They were relatively cool. But, economics has forced them to do a form of slavery. I have to be honest with that. And I've benefited from that. Lots of people do. So part of honoring the difficult is also knowing not only where your ancestors came from. So the person on the left is, on my father's side, the first person to come off the slave ship boat. Roselia Goodwine is the name that we know her by. And the picture on screen right is my first biological grandchild. I have, other relational grandchildren. But she is named after Grandma Zealy, Roselia Goodwine on the left, also known as Grandma Zealy, who was from Morocco and, sold by Muslims. She was probably Muslim, coming from Morocco, sold by Muslims to Christians for slavery when she was 4 years old, and made the Middle Passage when she was 4 years old. So there's a series on BET called The Book of Negroes. We're basically talking about this young girl who basically is shipped away, sold away, captured, and sold to America, and shows some of kind of like a sort of vanilla showing of what the Middle Passage would be, and I'm going to be showing a little more graphic, or the classic graphic. But Grandma Zealy made the voyage at 4, and was immediately sold away from her mom, who had an infant daughter. So, what can a 4-year-old do in terms of working in the cotton fields or Virginia plantations? Not known, but the family lore is that she taught herself to read and write and do math when that was clearly a death sentence to do that. And that's where we basically learned our love of books and taught our kids to read early and all that kind of stuff. That was the basic mythology that I was raised up with. So when my father said, yeah, you're the third person in our family to graduate high school since slavery, he's like, not exaggerating. That's real. So, okay, guess I gotta do what I gotta do. And, then teach this child, or attempt to teach this child, because at 4.5, she has a mind of her own. Definitely, she comes by it honest. So, in 11, I went to Ghana and to West Africa with a group of black yoga practitioners. And one of the places we went on the second day was this castle, Elmina Castle. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast because there is lots of gold there. Like I was telling you on your midterm about Guanine, when the king in Portugal told Christopher Columbus about Guanine, basically one of the kingdoms in Ghana had a gold nugget that he could tie his horse to, big enough to tie his horse to. So, you know how strong a horse is and how big a nugget has to be to be able to do that. There's lots of gold there.
How could they call that a nugget?
Yeah, well, big gold rock.
Right.
Boulder, a gold boulder, I guess. So this is the view from out there, from the bus that we're on, going there, and this is the view because there are cannons because people are trying to raid it. And what you can't see here is that this is on a cape, And on the other end of the bay is yet another slave castle, which we'll be visiting. But basically, where the sea level has receded a little bit because it used to come up to directly below these castle walls, and that's where they loaded people. But the cannons are there for a reason, because people were attacking it naturally. Yes?
In order to steal the slaves that were being held there prior to departure?
Pretty much, yeah.
Because they were a cash crop in a sense.
Yes, they were a cash crop, you could say. And anybody that, of course, so in part of this complex, so this is in the central courtyard. You can see the skull and crossbones. This is not a pirate haven. This is where if you protested in any way, they would basically throw you in here to die. And you will see what that is. So next to the death room, of course, is the church. And it's not to give them a Christian burial. It's basically to let you know that, you know, the church is sanctioning the activities that are going on here. Wish I was making that up, but I'm not. Understand what you're seeing here. This is the floor of the death room. So to clean it up for the tourists, what they had to excavate, well, what they thought was earth, but was not. So people were put in this room to die, not given food and water. And it's going to take some time to do that. Meanwhile, when you die, they will, cast you into the sea after they drag your body out. But, meanwhile, the products of defecation, dirt, et cetera, are going to build up. So they actually had to excavate all that. That green color is essentially what they thought was earth, but they found out by analysis it's not. It's packed feces, which then they excavated for the tourists to bare rock floor. But you can see how deep it is, because this was in use for several hundred years. It's built in it's like the oldest European building in sub-Saharan Africa, built in 1482. It's another view of it. This is our guide, and this is, basically the door through which you look, and this is our group, and I'm basically looking at, from the back to that door. And there were only, at this point, 10 of us standing in there, and it was already crowded, so think about what it would be if you didn't really care that people were crowded in there. And that's the ventilation, other than the door, which they have a wooden door over the iron door, too. So that's the sole source of ventilation. And that's looking out. So this room was where the women and children were kept. And you can also see kind of like the same sort of discoloration on the walls. But they were slightly better treated in that they got food. And they could be, I wouldn't say let out for exercise, because, you'll see in the next slide. So just imagine 150 to 200 people crammed in that room. This is the courtyard. So if you notice here, those 3 doors that are in the shot, that's one of those 3 doors there. And in this courtyard, it overlooks the rooms of the governor, the Portuguese governor. And what you can't see in this particular shot is that there's kind of like a cistern, which is kind of like a large well, which at high tide is fed by seawater. And so they would actually wash some of the women. So like we're gathered here, like our group is gathered here, the governor would look down on, the women and find women that he found attractive. They would be washed in the cistern and then brought up by a secret passageway. And that's the stairway that goes to this trap door. And then I didn't show the governor's, apartment because it wasn't really furnished, right? But you can imagine what's going on there. And this is, so interestingly enough for African Americans over the last certainly 20, 30 years, and I was part of that trend, and they're still doing tours to this particular place. So family lore has it that Grandma Zili was basically shipped out through the Ivory Coast from Morocco, which is basically one country over Côte d'Ivoire from Ghana. But the basic architecture of these slave forts was essentially the same. Pretty much there were like 45 of them ever built. So part of this door of no return is this is the last thing that you do, the last thing that you see before you get loaded onto a slave ship. And this is a Vodun altar. So we had actually participated in, assuming that this was put on by the tourists, but basically the folks that were doing this basically said that their religion is like 100,000 years old. And you can believe it, given what they do and all those kind of things. So this altar is at the other slave fort. So Elmina is like on one side of the bay, and on the other side of the bay is Cape Coast. So Elmina was built by the Portuguese, and Cape Coast was built by the British, when the British were in the slave trade. So Cape Coast was where Obama went in his first term. So there's a Vodun altar built over the door of no return at Cape Coast, and that's what this is. Yeah.
Did they did the Brits provide this altar?
No. This is actually the locals basically saying, okay, we recognize what happened here, that we need to, purify and cleanse this space, and, close off the door of no return.
So this is way after the fact?
Yeah, way after.
Okay.
This is like actually even after liberation, or shall we say independence, because I'm not certain it's liberated entirely, but they are independent anyway. One of the things I appreciated as an African American going over to Africa was, it's not so much the sense of returning home, but you really appreciate infrastructure here. And there's a definite difference between kicking out the British 200 plus years ago versus 50. Because there's certain things that you depend on when it was only 50, and 200 plus we can go, no, we ain't doing that. That's dumb. We have a better way, somewhat. So this is an attempt to culturally heal. And so when people talk about, when I identify, for example, the roots of Christianity as being an African religion, part of those roots basically are in religions that are between the cities, between building cities and the creation of cities like Egypt and civilization like Egypt, which then create the basic cultures from which at least the Abrahamic religions come from. But so, Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came out of the context where, Vodou, it actually is sort of like the cultural ground from which those spring. So the idea is that you have ancestors, and they're with you still, as long as you are alive and can remember them. And even if you don't remember them, they're still there. So there are 3 responses to chattel slavery. Now, the reason I'm saying Euro-American chattel slavery, it's the concept that chattel like rhymes with cattle, and you're essentially property. You're an animal. You're not, basically you're locked in that condition for the duration. You can't ever necessarily free yourself or improve yourself. So usually there is mastery, slavery, and then there's a condition called maroonage, and savagery and civilization will define all those things. So there are 3 conditions to consider within European or Euro-American chattel slavery. 3 different relationships: master, slave, and maroon. Now those 3 conditions interrelate with each other. Maroon is a Taino word which means wild and free, but it's also a condition by which a person who may or may not have been a slave, so slaves can escape slavery. But if all they know is, if they've been through a process of colonialism, if all they know is the master's culture, then all they can replicate is the master's culture away from the master. Maroonage basically says, we're not going to follow the master's culture at all. We're going to create our original culture, whatever that was, and because we are not in our home country anymore, we're going to adapt to this new land and create a condition of freedom in which we probably will have to violently resist the master's attempt to enslave us. So, savagery or sauvage from the French is from the American Heritage Dictionary. Savage, an adjective, not domesticated or cultivated, a primitive or uncivilized person, not civilized, barbaric, ferocious, fierce, vicious or merciless, brutal, lacking in polish or manners, rude. From Middle English, sauvage, which also itself came from Old French or Latin, silvaticus, of the woods, wild, where silva means forest. So this is why I like this particular type of dictionary that gives you not only where the words came from, but how they changed from language to language. Sauvage, or savagery. Civilization. A noun, a society that has a high level of culture and social organization, an advanced level of development in society that is marked by complex social and political organization and material, scientific, and artistic progress. All the societies at an advanced level of development considered collectively, places where people live rather than uninhabited areas, the level of material comfort that somebody is used to, the process of creating a high level of culture in a particular society or region. Again, this is from my Microsoft Word onboard dictionary. And so the idea about civilization, basically all of these features are found in a city. So this is a bias, as opposed to savages. The savages or the heathen live in the sticks. They live in the woods. They don't dwell in cities, right? So, mastery, referring to the chiefless societies in Africa before the rise of Egypt. That age grade system of rites of passage gave the individual skills of self-mastery, that is, self-knowledge, you know who you are, self-control, you know how to act, and therefore self-worth internally, independent of whatever else anybody else may think of you, internally. Then, once you have those three things as part of your self-mastery, you're responsible for those younger and responsible to those older. And you demonstrate that mastery in your daily conduct in human affairs, in relationship to a village or community or larger society. And you could become a leader by demonstrating an ability to unify people and serve their needs before your own. And this was considered royal worth. And anybody could display this at any time, at any given circumstances, which is why you could have among slaves leaders of slave rebellions. And they would arise. And people will recognize, okay, sounds good to me, because they were often educated to the same level, because this was universal without having a bureaucracy.
All across Africa.
All across Africa. Okay? So every slave was educated to this level, and every slave could have multiple languages, and if they were people of the book, definitely Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they could read. I mean, this was even demonstrated in that little BET, the Book of Negroes, where, okay, they're living tribally, right, in huts, but dad is teaching daughter how to read Allahu Akbar. There ain't no mosque in the village, but he's teaching her to read in Arabic, even though they're not Arabic. So again, yeah, how far does a literate meme spread? Well, pretty far. Slavery. In chiefless societies in Africa before the rise of cities or Egypt, slave was a person who, despite their education, could not control themselves or chose not to. They didn't heed the teaching of their elders or community. They acted selfishly, without honor or sense of justice. Their physical animal nature ruled them rather than their divine spiritual nature ruling their animal impulses. So if a conflict between nations would lead to physical war, people abandoned or otherwise captured became slaves, because they figured, okay, we stopped the war because y'all clearly have lost, so you can withdraw, take your wounded or your dead with you. We'll let you do that. But anybody that's left, okay, we'll take them. And those people, so there's no ready pool of slaves until there became a market to create captives of war. And that's often what certainly the chiefs that I met on that African tour would say. Yeah, well, yeah, they were captives of war. Sorry we sold you into slavery. We didn't know that it was going to be that bad. Put slavery out of your mind. No, we ain't gonna do that, sorry. But glad we make enough money to come here and visit you, telling us to forget slavery. No, we're not gonna do that. But thank you for your hospitality. Yeah.
So they would only take the captives once they knew there was a market for those captives into slavery?
They developed a market, right? So where slaves came from before the slave trade, because there was no slave caste, okay? You were captured in war, and you were captured only because your tribe abandoned you. And your tribe abandoned you because, okay, you were a coward, you didn't fight, you didn't, and this wasn't the beginning. I mean, yeah, people get scared in war, so all right, we don't want you because you ain't demonstrating that you want to be with us, so, right. So those are people who are captured, right, or abandoned, right, and those become your slaves, and it's not a permanent condition because you have the right to education and prove your worth and your freedom by acts of service, bravery, or whatever. So no ready pool of slaves. So that's where slaves came from, and slavery wasn't permanent. You could earn your way out of it It was only with the incentive, the cash incentive to like raid somebody's village and take somebody, that's an act of war, right? And then those people have an incentive to trade with Europeans for guns or rum or whatever they're trading for, and that's where the slave trade came from. Okay, where you're raiding people. So there was no, again, no population of slaves, just like there were no standing armies. But if your tribe went to war with another tribe, you were expected to fight, if you were of age to fight. And if you didn't, you better be doing something useful, because you got to take care of your peeps. So again, no slave corps, no standing armies. I mean, it's hard to think of that in these terms because we're Americans, right? So we're used to thinking in terms of, volunteer. I remember when there's a draft, so drafted armies or volunteer armies, but it's a separate thing that remains. You remain in the military for X amount of years or for life, right? Well, they didn't do that. We're always constantly at war. So essentially, the economic incentive to create free labor and free labor markets basically created the slave trade, and it was sustained. Okay, so a slave under the fundamental rights of African people had the right to earn their freedom through education and demonstrated mastery, same as any other person. So today, a slave can generally be defined in economic terms as a person who's forced to work exclusively for minimal room and board. Maybe a wage, but minimal room and board. And so when I did what I described with Foxconn in China, right, $20 a day to make iPhones for 12-hour shifts. They give you tea. Yeah. I'm not making that up. They give you tea and maybe a little food, and you can eat at the end of your shift, and in 12 hours you're back on. So generally, one has to be forced into this condition because nobody would do it willingly. So, people willing, for example, in terms of South America to, the whole illegal immigration piece here. Right. You're going to stay in Honduras, the murder capital of the planet. The gangs, the cartels, the gangs and the cartels basically say, okay, we need your kid, 6 or 7. Your kid needs to join the gang. If they don't, we'll kill them. So the kids split, wouldn't you? So they ride these trains from Mexico, through Guatemala, Honduras, into Mexico, to try and get across the border. Because, well, what should we do? Should we invade Honduras? Like we're going to invade Honduras? To stop that? Probably not. Right? So people have to be forced to come up here. So, historically in Africa, slaves are captives of war. They could be any race. It was only in the European colonies in Turtle Island, that is here, North, Central, and South America, that chattel, humans as property, slavery, came to be populated exclusively by one race. Historically planet-wide. So for example, when I described those odalisques, okay, those were white women captured by white slave traders who found it economically advantageous to sell it to the rich black guys with harems. Like, who has harems? Yeah, and what do the black guys have to trade? Well, lots of stuff. Gold, spices, silks, horses, whatever. But, there were slaves of all different races. So any African captive of war could be enslaved, but it was not a permanent condition in Africa. You could earn your freedom. So the European, this is a, I think that's a man-of-war class slave ship. So roughly about 500 folks. So on each floor, so the one below is the deepest hold just before the keel. And you can see how people are packed there, basically maybe 18 inches of personal space, if that. Very little ventilation. And that's the floor plan. So there are racks on each deck that could hold another 50 people. So I actually did the count. All right, so that's 400 people, and there's like 50 more on each deck, plus whatever they might have on the surface, on the top deck. All right, so there are actually slave ships that had 1,000 folks. So this is just the middle size. And this would also be, for example, you know, your typical sailing vessel that's like a pirate ship or something like that. So you've got cannons, you've got you know, food, you've got food and water, etc. So for example, with the Amistad, where if you saw that Steven Spielberg movie, even though it's not totally accurate, basically the fact that they had to throw people off because they were short of food and water, well, yeah, they did that. So, British colonies and later the Americas were the first places where slaves were restricted to one or two races, and that would be, with the British colonies, Africans, and in some cases Irish and Scots, too. So another condition, maroonage. With an inborn knowledge of the African constitution and rights system, Africans, of course, would rebel against chattel slavery. So, for example, in Africa, Queen Nzinga of what's now Angola started as a general of her brother's armies and later became queen. This is one of the societies where women could be military leaders as well as political leaders. So, defeat is a relative term with the Portuguese and with Europeans. But defeating the Portuguese in her early 20s, she ruled until her death at 81. Eventually what she had to do is make deals with the Portuguese because they kept coming. So victory wasn't entirely final. So the Portuguese never took us, well, this could be debated, really, whether they took a slave from her country during her reign, but that was kind of the intention. One of the stories told about her is she had beaten the Portuguese forces and went to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, who demanded that she be captured and wouldn't give her a chair to sit at the negotiating table, so her soldiers actually formed a chair out of her bodies, out of their bodies. And she sat down and said, okay, well, I guess we're at war. And so they lost that particular skirmish, that is the Portuguese. But out of her country, there is a martial art, which we know by its Brazilian name, capoeira. Came from Nzinga's country. It's kind of like an Afro-Brazilian form of karate, kung fu, which is set to music and drumming, and the basic imagery is it's a fight and a dance when you're practicing. So the practice form here is referred to in karate, karate in Japanese means empty hand. And a kata is a practice form. The same concept in capoeira is joga. And this is described as both a fight and a dance. Also to play. To play capoeira is to basically practice fight. Yeah. Escaping. Yeah. All right, so out of that country, even if we consider the martial arts training in that particular country, Angola, or what's now Angola, there were, and if you were armed with that particular martial art and you were captured as a slave, capoeira is a martial art you can do in chains and still be effective. So there were, according to the historical record, so understand how the historical record works, would you want the fact that there were 150 recorded slave revolts at sea on slave ships? Would you want that news getting out? Okay, so if there's only 150 recorded, there's probably more that weren't recorded. Particularly, for example, if they were successful. And here's how I define success. You take over the ship, you kill the crew completely, and you sail yourself back to Africa. Those are probably not going to be recorded. Because why would you? Okay, so when I talked about the pirate Lawrence de Graaf, okay, so he's recorded, he's successful, he never sailed himself back to Africa, but he took over the slave fleet by taking it one ship at a time before it got to Cuba. And basically, rather than going back to where he was from in Africa, he basically stuck around and basically went after Spanish shipping, the Spaniards who basically had enslaved him. And so not only basically going after Spanish fleets, but Spanish settlements all throughout Mexico and the Caribbean. Yeah.
So rather than deciding, let's just go home,
Yeah.
he became basically a seaborne guerrilla warrior.
Yeah. Pretty much. And capturing slave ships in particular and saying, okay, to the slaves, join us or die. And therefore, so what would you do? Die with the crew or live free as a pirate? Huh. Yo ho, yo ho. All right. So, of the successful ones, capoeira could have been used because you can use it, while in chains. So, successful rebellion, of course, means you take over the ship and sail yourself back home. That's how I'm narrowly defining success. So, the Amistad Affair, which we may talk about in a little while, is unsuccessful because they allowed the crew to live. So, part of the lesson from maroonage, never give a slaver an even break. Never, because they won't. It's also my opinion about rapists, but I think that anybody who's a potential target for rape should be able to kill their opponent. Save the state the expense of a trial. Because they wouldn't hesitate to kill you. Just saying. So, in Brazil, in fact, everywhere there was chattel slavery, slaves escaped and formed their own communities. In Brazil, the first non-European, non-Indian republic was a quilombo, which is their word for what that is. A quilombo called Palmares, which also has to do with the fact that there are coconut palm trees there. So a quilombo is a community, also a republic, and by the way, it's called a republic because you can successfully, and they did successfully, resist military incursions to come capture them and take over the city. Palmares, for example, lasted for a century in the Brazilian jungle before it was overrun, and there were quilombos actually to the present day. So the Maroons at Palmares maintained that free republic for nearly a century, and even after it fell, their active resistance continued for a century even after that. So there are some quilombos today in Brazil, but very similar to what was happening to the Maroon towns in Jamaica, it's harder to fight a multinational with the concept of ownership of land. You know, killing Bill Gates would not stop Microsoft. How do you attack a multinational? This graphic is a graphic of Cristobal Colon making first contact at Guanahani Island with the Taínos. This is from the point of view, of course, of the Spanish. Because the Taínos kind of don't look like they live in a hot place. So, slaves can escape slavery. And if all they know is the master's culture, then they can't be free even by escaping slavery. A Maroon escapes slavery and recreates their original free culture, or creates a free culture in the place of masses culture. So, Maroon is that Taino word, which means wild, untamed, free. The Spanish reportedly wiped out all the Taino on one particular island, thinking that they had wiped them all out. In fact, you can find references when you Google Taino that they're extinct. Well, they're not, actually. And notice who's saying that they're extinct. So this particular graphic, when you Google, when you Google the term Maroon, comes up. So the Taino, all throughout the Caribbean, in fact, there are three tribal groups. There are the Caribs, also Canib, from what we get the word cannibal. Caribbean, Arawak.
And what exactly are these?
These are native nations that, say, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, migrated up from what we call South America and occupied the islands of the Caribbean, all of them. Okay, so Jamaica means land of the springs in Arawak. Boriken is a Taino word for Puerto Rico. Guanahani Island was the name for where Cristobal Colon made first contact with the Taino. Right? I mean, they named it first. They were there. Right? So, yeah, the Taino nation made first contact with Cristobal Colon October 12, 1492 at Guanahani Island. Or you could say Columbus discovered America. Well, who did he discover? Indians. Well, which Indians? They leave that out of the story. No, we don't do that. This is ethnic studies. Right? Taino nation made first contact with Cristobal Colon at Guanahani Island on this date. We don't know what calendar it was for the Taino. But here's what we do know about the Taino. How many of you have eaten barbecue? Barbecue comes from the Taino word barbacoa. How many of you have ridden in a canoe? Canoe is a Taino word for that kind of craft. Hurricane is their word for the storm, but it's a god of the storm. Iguana is a Taino word. Cassava is a Taino word. Hammock is a Taino word. So how is it we know all these words that came from the Taino language, even though some dictionaries say it's Spanish? No, it ain't Spanish. Oh, like you wipe them out. Right. Maybe on one island, but they're all through that. And by the way, the Taino, basically their culture at home, because it's like tropical, they make nets in the sea for raising fish. They cultivate sea turtles for their eggs. These are people that hunt sharks from canoes by jumping on them. I'm not thinking that they're going to be pushovers in war. They being nice to Columbus like he's writing in his log, oh, with 50 guys, we could enslave them. No. They're being cool with you because they're expecting the return of the good white brother that the Salagi talked about 2,800 years before. Columbus wasn't the good white brother. I'm sorry. Mistaken identity. All right, so the Taino joined with others, notably Africans, who were there before the slave trade and fought back. So others included African slaves under the Spanish who were left when the Spanish abandoned Jamaica in 1655. So the British attempted to re-enslave the Africans. But no, don't think so. So I actually have a color graphic of this, but this is a Suriname maroon. You can tell that, well, one, he's dressed for the weather. Two, he's got an axe, he's got a weapon. And, there's a skull at his feet. Doesn't mean that this is a meal. This means that you probably don't want to mess with him because he'll kill you rather than go back into slavery. This is a British drawing of a group of Maroons negotiating a peace treaty with the British, because the British lost. So picture this. Jamaica, the land of the springs, was held by the Spanish, who abandoned it to a British fleet, leaving an entire population of Tainos and African slaves left by the Spanish, who basically take to the hills, ally with the Spanish, arm themselves militarily, and basically, okay, we're retreating into the hills. And if you want to come get us, you're going to have to come after us. But if they established, plantations or whatever, so here's what the Maroons do. Maroons are about they're being wild and free. So you leave us alone would be cool. But if you come and capture our folks, we're coming to get them. And if you get in our way, you're dead. And if you come after us, you're dead. Literally. Because they had folks like, well, I'll show you shortly. So the Maroons of Jamaica negotiated on their terms a peace treaty with British planters. So one of the things that they are doing is they're raiding British plantations for goods, livestock, and people. Guerrilla warfare, whatever, it worked. But so the British couldn't beat them militarily, couldn't enslave them, couldn't stop their raids, freeing slaves, livestock, foodstuffs, whatever. So they negotiated a peace treaty. So they cut a deal where the Maroons could hunt undisturbed, and they also agreed to stop the raids and could also sue a planter in court, while they had immunity in the court. So imagine the conditions where the British are going to do that for what they consider a ragtag group, right? So with Jamaica, so that deal was cut in the 1700s. So with Jamaican independence in 1963, I believe it was, the Brits had to cut a separate deal with the Maroons in the mountains who maintained their independence to this day, because they said, we're not Jamaica. You never defeated us. We were never a colony. And we have this piece of paper that you signed, basically under duress, because you lost. So last week when I showed you that, those 3 Maroon chieftains in front of the White House, one from Suriname, one from Texas, and one from Jamaica. Basically, this is a Jamaican brother, Jamaican Maroon chief displaying the copy of the treaty with the British. Notice who's in the background. Martin Luther King. So Maroon General, like Nzinga before her and Harriet Tubman after her, a woman general who isn't just a military leader, she's a cultural leader. So the Coromantee Maroons practiced and spoke the Akan language and culture. Now, the Akan are a group from Ghana where the Adinkra symbols, if you remember those, the Adinkra symbols came from that alphabet that has symbolic meaning and all that. We use it in rites of passage, and showed Eugenia May, it's on my Ankh actually. So the Akan people, the British thought that the Akan would civilize the rest of their slaves because they were militaristic and disciplined. Yeah, right. Only a Brit would think like that. You're going to capture an African, take them to Jamaica because they have a militaristic culture, and then you think that they're going to organize black people for you? Seriously, you're thinking that? No. Don't think so. So they practiced, not only spoke the Akan language and culture, practiced egalitarian political and military structures. So in other words, any person could attain any position regardless of sex if they displayed the required characteristics, for example, royal worth. So Nanny, who is a national hero in Jamaica, was one such woman, a general. So following in the footsteps of Nzinga and presaging, as I said, Harriet Tubman, she crafted effective battle plans. She also told stories and gave instructions on African culture. So for example, got this, it's a now defunct website, but it had an active GIF, which when you put your cursor over what looks like a short banana tree, that image, so this is superimposed, this is actually a guy with a spear. There's 3 of them in the picture. Yeah, right behind him, and then farther on. So imagine you're a British column chasing these decoys into the jungle, trying to capture them, right? And you're, of course, military fashion, European warfare like you've seen from the movies. Okay, they're standing in a line, shooting at each other in a line like gentlemen, like it's a duel. Dumb. But okay, whatever. That's civilized warfare, right? So you can't fight like that in the jungle. You're following these guys in the jungle path, and you're not going to shoot till you're sure your target. So, you're walking through the woods, and all of a sudden you hear this bird call, and all of a sudden, boom, the forest has now come alive with armed, angry, machete, spear-carrying black folks with guns that wipe you out. Well, that's not civilized. Yeah, okay.
The way to die.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'd negotiate a peace treaty too. Makes sense, right? So, that was Nanny's idea. I mean, wow. So, $500 bill, Bank of Jamaica, any of the Maroons. Movies. You can, I think these are on Netflix. I actually have copies of them, and we used to think about doing what I call Afro Blue at the movies, where we basically have, so these two films, so Sankofa, the synopsis is, these are filmed basically written, directed, shot by black people. Sankofa by Ethiopian Haile Drama, which Sankofa is one of the Adinkra symbols. And basically it's a time travel kind of science fiction-y thing where a black American fashion model on a photo shoot in Africa at, I think it's Elmina, is spiritually transported back to a plantation in the West Indies where she experiences firsthand the physical and psychic horrors of chattel slavery, and eventually the redemptive power, community, and rebellion, as she becomes a member of a freedom-seeking Maroon colony. And Muda Baruka is basically playing one of the Maroons. And they're basic, you know, this is like a Maroon's eye view of slavery, and it's fairly intense as a movie. Otherwise, you know, we have shown it in decades past with this class, but when we weren't televising it. Actually, I did get permission to use it, but I think you might be able to get it on Netflix. But it's intense. So, for example, it shows a woman who's been beaten to death, and they deliver her kid, which, you know, really did happen, you know, because she was trying to escape to the Maroons and got caught before she could do that. So they whipped her to death, and then, you know, they took the kid, who, yeah, that's a whole other story. I'm not going to do a spoiler alert. Quilombo is basically a Brazilian film talking about Palmares, with some great music by Gilberto Gil. So we talked a little bit about Afro-Europeans. So part of, and I'm going to cover some people that we didn't cover, besides Beethoven and Charlotte. So the meme of white supremacy can express in contradicting ways a love, hate, respect, and fetishism. So when you fetishize something, you kind of like put it on a pedestal. It's like a collector's item. You don't really respect it as it's an object to be collected. You don't really respect its individuality. And that was part of the experience that a lot of Afro-Europeans experienced. Here they were kind of exemplars of their race, but they were conforming to European values, and that kind of reinforced, oh, we're the best, because here you are, you're the best of your race, and you can represent them, right? So slaves could be bought, freed, and put on a pedestal, but only rare instances would they be considered equal. And even if they sat on the throne like Charlotte, their race could be used against them, like Charlotte. So Ibrahim Ganabal, yeah, he's dressed up and he's a page to Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, but he's still essentially, and he's got sent to French military school, but he's not necessarily a free citizen. So yeah, that was Ibrahim Ganabal with Peter the Great. So Angelo Solomon. This is a graphic of a museum, an Afrikaner in Wien, which is Vienna. So Vienna, Austria. So he was born probably in present-day northeastern Nigeria or northern Cameroon. He died in Vienna. He was taken to Europe as a slave. He was freed and achieved prominence in Viennese society and Freemasonry. He's a Freemason. Contemporary of Mozart, I think. So, probably belonged to the Kanuri ethnic group. His original name was Mamadi Make, linked to a princely class in the Sokoto state in modern Nigeria. Is taken captive as a child and arrived in France, Marseille, as a slave, eventually transferring to the household of a marchioness in Messina, who oversaw his education. Out of affection for another servant of the household, he adopted the name Angelo and chose to celebrate September 11th as his baptismal day, as his birthday. After repeated requests, he was given as a gift to Prince George Christian, the imperial governor of Sicily. He became the prince's valet and traveling companion, accompanying him on military campaigns throughout Europe. And after the prince's death, he was taken into the Vienna household of Joseph Wenzel, who was a prince of Liechtenstein, and eventually rose to be his chief servant, and then became a royal tutor to the prince, the son of the prince. So, he was a cultured man, highly respected in the intellectual circles of Vienna, was counted as a valued friend by the Austrian emperor and Count Franz Moritz von Lacy. He joined the Masons, True Harmony, whose membership included Vienna's influential artists like Mozart, Haydn, and the Hungarian poet Ferenc Kaczynski. So large records that indicate that he and Mozart met on several occasions, and that the character Bassa Selim in Mozart's opera The Abduction from the Seraglio was based on Solomon. So while he was considered cool and considered, during his life he was regarded as a model of the assimilation and perfectibility of Africans. That is, the best thing that can happen to Africans is they can be removed from their savage state and improved by European society. But get this, after he dies, they don't give him a Christian burial, they stuff him and mount his body and put it on display in a museum. And despite, his family's, can we bury our dad here? They don't do that. There's a fire in the museum that destroys it. Yeah, so doesn't matter that you're a Freemason or that you show, royal worth on European terms. So, that's what I was talking about, the fetishization. Like, wow, you're exceptional, but you're still not human. So, beneath that appearance of integration was basically kind of like a objectification at the same time. So, this is basically taken from the website of that particular exhibit, and I'm going to move on from it. We talked about Beethoven already, but here are some of the graphics. Now, this is the book that, this is J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, Volume 3. And Rogers was a black man who married a white Scandinavian woman and was pretty much obsessed with the whole idea of race mixing. Because in his time when he first published these books, so I have these first editions from 1945 when the hardback book cost $5, right? And says that, right? So Grandpa, I bequeathed those from Grandpa. And, in it was this picture. So when I said this in 5th grade, Beethoven was black, and they go, Mark, Beethoven couldn't be black because he's German, blah, 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 blah. I got a picture, and it doesn't look like your little thing. So what this picture is 10 years before his death. It's a life mask. It's cast in wax, and then they cast it in bronze later. So the wax casting, which, we'll look at his nose, look at his lips, and you can just barely make out the hairline. short afro. So that kind of goes along with the swarthy, mulatto, already brown face kind of piece. And then Esterhazy referring to Haydn as blackamoor. So it makes sense that Solomon was kicking it with Haydn and Mozart. Because I'm saying there are Afro-Europeans. There are black people living in these societies, contributing to them. And this is basically the book with the quotes. Let's see, Grill Parser, describing Beethoven. Beethoven's color according to his contemporaries, so these are people who knew him. Beethoven's color according to his biographers. So the books that Rogers is quoting were basically out of print by the time I got to this. So this book was published in 1935 originally. So obviously in 1935, a book that he's quoting in the late 1800s is still going to be in print, but they're not going to be in print now. Yeah, Grillparzer dark, Bettina von Arno brown, dark red, hair bristly, red and brown, brownish, short, ugly. And this is described Queen Charlotte by her physician, who said that she had a true mulatto face. So mulatto is a Portuguese slaver term referring to a first-generation black-white mix. Jefferson added refinements to the mixed race concept, creating quadroon, octoroon, and the one-drop rule of 1/64. And this concept was then also applied to Native Americans, so 1/8 to 1/16. And after 1/8 and 1/16, you're no longer Indian. And then Hawaiian, 1/2. After Hawaiian, you're not. After 1/2, you're not Hawaiian anymore. So different standards for different purposes of discrimination. So this particular meme, since I didn't show it to you before, but I want to show you where this came from. The idea originally, the meme itself originally came from the Moors who enslaved Europeans to make quarter horses. And you can't make a quarter horse unless you know what a quarter is, which means I have to teach you how to read and write, keep records, and do numbers, right? So the concept is for horses, because there's no point in applying it to people, because who bothers counting after 1/2? Really? Are you a quarter Irish? No, I mean, okay, we laugh at that, right? It's crazy. What? So why am I a quarter Cherokee? Why do we care about that? It's basically a system of discrimination. So the idea of racial purity that started with the Inquisition, with the Catholics, and was later adopted by the Ku Klux Klan, okay? 4 or 5, 6 or 700 years of this concept, racial purity. What's that exactly? Like, can you really trace your bloodlines all the way back and say that it's pure? Where? How far? Like, you know, okay, I know who my great-great-grandparents are. Roselia knows who that she's named for her quintuple great-grandmother. But how many people can do that? So, I mean, it's important to know your roots if you can without Ancestry.com. But, you know. So, if you go back to slide, if you would. All right. So, the idea of racial purity, also known in Indian country as blood quantum, or thinning the blood, and also the concept of half-breed. So there's 2 columns, but I'm basically showing you from my little Macintosh. So blood quantum for beginners, all right? So the following basically assumes only one quote-unquote purebred per generation. So understand, there ain't nobody purebred, but people want to persist in thinking that, you know, wow, I'm 1/32 white. Like, do I have any credibility in saying that? Well, it's true, but, you know, when I say 1/32, well, that's one white man among my great-great-great-grandparents. I'm not going to get away with that. So, one half to one parent, full blood. And so if you're black, that's mulatto, was the Portuguese slaver term. If you're Indian, the half-breed, Ayesca is a Lakota word, which means trader. That is Trader, not a traitor, though it can sometimes be, oh yeah, you're a half-breed traitor, you're not really Indian. No, that came from the first people that they encountered. The first white people the Lakota encountered were French traders, fur trappers. Actually, they wanted to kill them, or the men did, because that guy's sick. Why is he so pale? The women said, that's his color. Remember the story, right? 4 races? Oh, yeah. 1/4 grandparents, black quadroon. 1/8 great-grandparents, federal Indian cutoff originally, so that's 1/8 for every tribe except for the Cherokee, who self-define as, they'll take you with it, 1/16 with your say-so. So black octoroon is 1/8, 1/16. The Cherokee cutoff, 1/32, and then the 1-drop rule. 1 great-great-great-great-grandparent, so minimum Southern qualification to be black. So understand, a mulatto,
Wait, what?
yeah, that's where the 1-drop rule came from. That's what the definition is. So it's not that, if you're following the logic, like you're looking for sense for this, okay. The sense is we're trying to discriminate and justifying it by a mythical concept called race. We're pretending that this concept is real and that you can measure it. All right? So a mulatto person can be blonde hair and blue-eyed or pass for white. Can be. Like, you know, the granddaughter I showed you has blue eyes when she was born. She could pass for white, except for her nose and lips, unless you know what to look for. So she could pass for white. So this is often an issue in terms of people living within societies where there's a racial construct of racial superiority. You know, you want to look like the dominant group and adopt the mores of the dominant group. But even adopting those things, as Angelo Solomon could have told you, don't get you everything. Right? So apply to Africans, 1/64 to deny equal access by law and custom. Right? And as applied to First Nations, Native Americans, 1/8 Indian for the purposes of removing tribal land rights. Okay? So you would think then, looking at the logic of this chart, that black blood is stronger than Indian blood, right? No. That's not what it is. Right? So what they're trying to do with Indians is, by devising a construct like this, is they're trying to get rid of the Indians. You don't exist. You legally don't exist after 1/8. And they want to do that, you know, they refine that technique with Hawaiians. Oh, you don't exist. You have no right to your own homeland after half. And so in Oregon, for example, they kill off all the Indian men and then marry the Indian women to settlers who don't have wives, but then their kids will have no right, after 2 generations, to any land rights if they're surviving Indians. See the plan. I mean, it's brilliant, really. Fiendishly clever, as Farrakhan would say. Yeah.
So just so really an extremely involved system to justify legal theft.
Yes. Indeed. Indeed it is. Yeah, so, like I say at the bottom, is black blood stronger than native blood? No. Is black blood stronger than Hawaiian blood? No. Okay? So when I say that logic is a means to reason to an answer, the answer doesn't have to be true. It also doesn't have to make sense, i.e. being true. Okay? But what I'm doing by illuminating that system, okay, where this came from, the Moors, but they're not using it on humans. The concept wasn't designed for humans. Doesn't make sense. You're 1/32nd German. I mean, and so when we think about our language, our concepts of race, yeah, my grandmother was a Cherokee princess. Okay, well, they didn't have royalty, and what blood quantum are you talking about? And yeah, is that 1/32nd? What is that? So, another Maroon society south of the so-called border occurred in Mexico. So, the Spanish brought between 200,000 to 500,000 African slaves to Mexico. Because you remember, yeah, they have a slave fleet too, to work the mines and sugar plantations. The first slave uprising was in 1537, where the African slaves escaped and joined with the Chichimec Indians to form an alliance to drive out the white Castilian Spanish settlers. A term for these alliances and independent communities coming from the Taino language Maroon. There were various names for them. So the Maroon colonies, one of the most numerous of them was from Veracruz, which is also one of the sites of where the Olmec heads are. So we have some evidence of African contact before the slave trade. Slave rebellion in the sugar fields of 1570. The rebel leader, Gaspar Yanga, was a slave from the African nation of Gabon, and it was said he was from the royal family. So there's an interesting meme running through here where it's basically talking about many of these captured Africans being of royal blood or whatever, but that's a different sense than the European where you just become royal because your daddy was royal, your mama was royal. But in the African sense, you're royal because of how you act, not necessarily because of your bloodline. So he led his rebel band into the mountains, where he founded a locale sufficiently remote to settle and created his own small town of 500 people. The Yangans, as they were called, secured provisions by raiding upon the Spanish caravans, bringing goods from the highlands to Veracruz. So notice that model for how do you keep a Maroon society going? Okay, rip off the colonists, the colonialists that brought us here in the first place. Relations were established with neighboring runaway slaves and Indians, so for more than 30 years they lived free while their community grew in size, and some of those towns still exist. And then he negotiated a treaty with the Spanish, giving his community a free town status, that any slave making it there was free. So I bring this up in terms of the condition of Maroonage. The Columbus discovered America narrative about slavery doesn't talk about these societies at all. Just says, oh, you're a slave, you run away, we'll catch you. No. Not if we run far enough. Or if we run not if we run into places where it's Indian country that you don't want to go, like a swamp, like the Seminoles, or Mexico, or wherever. Vicente Guerrero. This is the first, well, he's the second president of Mexico, but he was a slave, black Indian. So according to J. Rogers, second president, black Indian and a former slave, he outlawed slavery throughout all Mexico, which at the time included all the states in the future America states with Spanish names: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Tejas. All of them. So in the narrative of, if you know popular culture through movies like Zorro, the whole mythology of Zorro is that, we're still under Spanish rule, but we're about to become America, so we're negotiating that because we just fought this war with Mexico, and Mexico lost, etc. So, born in 1782, was murdered in 1831. He's commander-in-chief of the Mexican Army during the last 3 years of their war of independence from Spain, member of a junta group that ruled Mexico for part of 23 and 24 and was president from 1829 till early 1830. He was raised in traditional indigenous barrio in Tixla in Guerrero State, which is named after him. His ability to speak indigenous languages helped him politically to push a broad Moreño, dark-skinned majority rule for his nation. Now, understand, because of the Spanish Inquisition, Limpieza de la Raza, they have a very elaborate, just like Jefferson did for the English-speaking world, the Spanish have this construct of racial hierarchy based on how light you are. 2, right? So it goes from like blanco, which means white, Moreño, which you know more means black, right? To Zambo. Right? And so these are all, and also then in between Blanco and Moreño is Mestizo.
What is Zambo? Sorry.
Like Sambo. Blue, black.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, purple, blurple. Right.
Right.
Zambo. All right, so basically, Blanco, Mestizo, and then Castiliano is Castiliano. So these are Spaniards from Spain. In fact, in New Mexico, you'll basically have people who, no, we aren't Mexican, we're Spaniards. We don't want to have nothing to do with Mexico because, well, why is that? Well, because we don't mix with Indians. We're Spaniards. We don't mix with Indians or black people. We're Spaniards. Yeah.
Isn't that one of the main differences between Haiti and Santo Domingo? Wasn't that one of the...
That island had been, the reason that the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo, right? Okay? One side's Spanish, the other side's French, is because all those colonial powers were fighting over those islands. I mean, the Spanish held Jamaica until they abandoned it and the British came. And that's why British is a British colony, right? Haiti, France, and Spain are fighting, so they divide the island kind of in half. Yeah. How's that working out? But, back to this. In terms of Mestizo is you're mixed with Native Americans or Los Indios. And then these others are you're mixed with black. Now, on the black side, they don't necessarily make that distinction. People like Guerrero exist. But when he's talking about creating a Moreno society in Guerrero State, that means there's enough of them to do that. Like we've been mixing with the Indians for long enough that, okay, we're a majority, and the Indians are either elsewhere or, you know, we're not going to basically accept any conditions of inequality. Back to slide, if you would, thanks. So his political philosophy was capitalized in a speech he made after assuming the presidency. He said, in part, the administration is obliged to procure the widest possible benefits and apply them from the palace of the rich to the wooden shack of the humble laborer. If one can succeed in spreading the guarantees of the individual, if the equality before the law is destroys the efforts of power and gold, if the highest title between us is that of citizen, if the rewards we bestow are exclusively for talent and virtue, we have a republic, and she will be conserved for the universal suffrage of a people solid, free, and happy. We have defeated the Colossus Spain, and we bathe in the glow of newfound happiness. We now know the way to genuine freedom, which is to live with the knowledge that no one is above anyone else, that there is no title more honored than that of the citizen, and that applies be the person in the military, a private worker, a government official, a cleric, a landowner, a laborer, a craftsman, or a writer, because of the sacred belief in equality has leveled us before the law. So they're basically eliminating, or attempting to eliminate the social hierarchies imposed on them by Spain. And he designed the Mexican flag. So the flag of Mexico was selected. Various meanings for the three colors have been given over the years, but from Roger's point of view, the original meanings were green for the color of the land that is now free and independent from Spain, white for our respect for the church, because the church is all about purity, right? White. And red for the color of the blood that flows alike through all of us, whether we're African, native, or Castilian. So it's said that Guerrero was the main designer of the flag and the author of its meaning, which also in the center you have the eagle on a prickly pear cactus eating a snake. So when I showed you the secretary bird, this was a symbol from Africa that basically, an eagle that eats a snake. And so this is kind of the mythology around, we're going to put Mexico City where we see this eagle eating the snake. So Mexicatahue means all my relations in Aztec, and Mexico is derived from Mexica. So after Guerrero's murder, Mexico went to war with America, according to J. Rogers, over the issue of slavery. So white Americans had brought black slaves into Tejas, which was part of Mexico. When Guerrero's actions freed those slaves, the slave owners went to the U.S. government and actually petitioned Congress. Stop this. So the Amistad Affair, what those things depicted in Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad, in which the former president is depicted as saying that he has no interest in slavery. That's a lie. That is a straight up lie, because 3 years before that, Mexico again had achieved independence from Spain and freed its slaves, but slavery continued in other Spanish colonies, notably Cuba, where the Amistad cargo was bought. And there was also a free black population in Cuba That was basically fighting slavery and fighting to have equal rights too. Cuba has always had that kind of history, fighting against colonialism. So 3 years before the Amistad, former President John Quincy Adams denounced the Texas slaveholders' petition to Congress as not promoting freedom for Texans as much as protecting slavery. That doesn't sound like somebody who's indifferent to slavery at all. And since Spielberg is such a history buff, why didn't he include that? But otherwise, right? So remember the Alamo? Yeah, okay. So the Alamo is not about freedom from evil Mexico. It's about protecting slavery. Because Texas was free already, a free state already. But, yeah, remember the Alamo, sure. All right? So, as a result of losing the war, Mexico lost all the territory and the present quote-unquote border was created. So, therefore, people who were free people of color in all those states all of a sudden became Americans with racial discrimination. Okay, and of course, at that point, the native nations themselves weren't conquered, but that would come later with Manifest Destiny. I'm going to talk a little bit for the last 5 minutes about Six Nations, because this whole Mexico to America piece, where Mexico is established not only as a free state, that is, no slavery, also egalitarian, also having free people of color, which is a model that's not necessarily going to become widespread in America until, well into the 20th or 21st century in terms of the facts. But to talk about one of the reasons I talk about Six Nations, Iroquois Six Nations, is that when I talk about indigenous democracy, because we've talked about African basis of democracy, but we could also talk about the democracy that was here already. So one example of that is the Iroquois Confederacy, which is composed of 6 nations. So each nation has clans, spelled with a C. So a person's clan is the same as their mother's clan. The members of each clan are all related to each other through their mothers, and this is called basically a matrilineal system. And each clan is represented by a different animal. Traditionally, a person could not marry someone within the same clan. They would have to marry in another clan. And the reason I'm setting up this concept for 6 nations is that it's being run by the clan mothers. That is, the matriarchal heads of the clans. They're running the country, and they select the chiefs. So when I'm talking about democracy, everybody's clan is represented by a clan mother who then selects a male chief, maybe even a female chief, but let's just say a male chief. And the chief has to be related by blood or marriage to a clan mother. So the clan mothers can elect chiefs or select chiefs, but the chiefs cannot unselect the clan mothers. Okay, so this is an important distinction, because it's the clan mothers who basically say, look, if we're going to go to war, then you and the opposing chief that you want to go to war with have to meet in front of all the tribes in council and fail to reach an agreement in 3 sessions. And at each time, you could be unchiefed if it's clear the problem is you. Because our sons and daughters are not going to die because you have an ego problem. All right? So, and this system had been running since like 1100 AD in that part of the world, which we're talking about New York, Connecticut, all the places where the Iroquois Confederacy is. And so when the founding fathers are like trying to figure out how we're gonna do a democracy, the model is not coming from England, how to do democracy. Though they do have kind of a model, right? So back to slide. So each clan represented by a different animal. So for example, presently 9 clans divided into animals from 3 earth elements, land, air, and water. The water creatures are turtle, beaver, and eel. The land creatures are deer, wolf, and bear. And the creatures of the sky are hawk, heron, and snipe. Snipe is where we get sniper, because snipe moves really fast. It's a water bird, and you usually don't see or hear it. They're hidden, and they're hard to hunt. So Iroquois, 6 nations. So the natural world is symbolized by these beings, and so you belong to a clan of one of these 9 creatures, and before there was, more clans. But essentially, that matrilineal system, women-centered system of democracy meant that everybody was represented as part of the group without discrimination. All right, see you Monday.
Where can we turn in the?
If you haven't visited